How did this start out with this? Welcome to Intrigued Mind, and this is the story of heroin. Heroin is an opiate. Opiates have been around for a long time, almost as long as human civilization, in the form of the poppy seed. The poppy's latex, often referred to as its milk, was given the name opium by the ancient Greeks. It contains morphine, now a famous natural narcotic, which was isolated and identified in Germany during the early 1800s. It was named after the Greek god Morpheus, associated with sleep and dreams. This guy's name, being the character who woke Neo from simulated reality, was no coincidence. The 1800s were really the heyday of opium. English artists of the Romantic movement, like Percy Shelley, John Keats, and Lord Byron, used the drug recreationally to inspire their literature. Its sedative qualities made it the anesthesia of choice during the US Civil War, when hundreds of soldiers were getting dismembered, blown up, and cut up every day. Pharmacists and physicians all across the West also recommended it as cough medicine and painkiller for a wide range of respiratory and physical ailments. Despite opium's medical benefits, it was extremely addictive and therefore ruined lives. British trade of opium famously hooked the Chinese throughout the 19th century, and profits were so high that the British fought 2 wars to ensure the sale of opium went uninterrupted. Near the turn of the century, opium was an international public health disaster, but its medicinal benefits simply could not be ignored. Respiratory diseases were decimating millions of people all over the world. In Europe alone, nearly a quarter of all deaths were caused by tuberculosis. Pneumonia also ravaged families and communities. People could be completely incapacitated by a cough or a common cold. In Wuppertal, northwest Germany, a chemist called Heinrich Dresser thought he found the solution. In the 1890s, Dresser was working for a dyestuffs factory called Bayer, famous at the time for mass-producing a synthetic dye for indigo. When Dresser was there, Bayer was branching out into pharmaceuticals. Dresser was as much an entrepreneur as a chemist. He tasked his researchers to recreate a drug that had been discovered some 23 years earlier by a British chemist named C.R. Alder Wright. In 1874, Wright was experimenting combining morphine with acids while at the medical school he worked at in London. He boiled morphine with acetic anhydride, a chemical now used for a range of products, from wood preservatives to cigarette filters. After several hours of boiling, the liquid had turned to a white, bitter, crystalline powder. Wright had just created heroin. He named it diamorphine, or diacetylmorphine, and tested it on rabbits and dogs before publishing the results. Though it was clearly one powerful drug, the discovery was shelved and forgotten about. 23 years later, Dresser was intent on resurrecting the drug from oblivion. In 1897, one of his employees, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann, had discovered one of the most famous pharmaceutical drugs of the modern age, aspirin. Though the discovery was praised by Bayer's chemistry team, Dresser was unimpressed. He thought the compound could weaken the heart and said, "The product has no value." Aspirin was dropped, and Dresser pushed his chemistry team to get to work on morphine and acetic anhydride. Within just 2 weeks of aspirin's discovery, Felix Hoffmann had synthesized heroin. It was first tested on frogs and rabbits before moving on to human trials. Dresser himself tested it. When it was clear just how potent the compound was, Dresser got to work on medical articles. He described it as a wonder drug, saying that it was 10 times more effective than codeine as a cough medicine and superior to morphine as a painkiller. Above all, it was completely non-addictive and harmless. More work poured out from other chemists and physicians, praising the drug, and within no time, the compound was ready for mass production. Wright's chemical name for it, diacetylmorphine, didn't exactly roll off the tongue, so Dresser used a name inspired from the reactions of employees after trying the drug themselves, saying it made them feel heroic, or at least that's the story they spun. Dresser began to mass-market heroin as the drug of choice for treating asthma, bronchitis, tuberculosis, and phthisis. It was a heroin for the world. Free samples were sent out by the thousands to physicians in Europe and the US. When they realized just how effective it was, demand soared. Dresser was more than ready to supply it, and in a wide range of forms. Bayer produced heroin mixed with pastilles, dissolvable salts, elixirs, cough drops, you name it. Heroin was never advertised to the general public, but given how much physicians were dishing them out, it might as well have been. By 1899, Bayer was producing about a ton of heroin a year, sold across 23 countries. Just take a look at some of the Hispanic adverts. This kid's looking at the heroin cough syrup like Keith Richards looks at a bottle of Jack Daniels. Then there's what looks like a really disturbing parody of Mary Poppins. And this. Mr. Banks is on it too. And if your childhood hasn't been completely ruined, well, there's no saying the lives of the children and adults who actually did take the heroin weren't affected for the worst. People began to realize that Baer's heroin was in fact extremely addictive. Morphine addiction was already a huge problem in the US. When the new drug was introduced, though, it was just replaced by addiction to heroin. One philanthropic association was even sending out free packs of heroin to morphine addicts. By 1902, American and French researchers were reporting that heroism, as it were, was rampant among the working classes. Sales just kept going up and up. Regulations were lax, and a craze for patent drugs made Dresser extremely wealthy. By 1906, the American Medical Association approved heroin for medical use, even if they'd recorded addiction among its users. In 1913, addiction levels in the US were so high, particularly in New York and Philadelphia, that it seemed inevitable prohibition was on its way. In that same year, Baer stopped manufacturing heroin. It instead diverted its attention to aspirin, the compound which was initially abandoned, but which eventually would become one of the most popular over-the-counter painkillers in the world, and make Baer a household name. As Baer had foreseen in 1914, the use of heroin without prescription was outlawed in the US. The act was passed following a campaign vilifying blacks, Chinese, and Mexicans as murderers and rapists while under the influence of the mind-altering drug. In reality, the average heroin user was white, rich, and female. Heroin was often prescribed to control menstrual pain. At the same time in Europe, while in the throes of World War I, kits with morphine, heroin, or even cocaine, as well as a syringe and vials, were still being sold over the counter. Wives would send their husbands kits to make sure they had the best treatment available. Large numbers of soldiers would return from the front as addicts. Though Baer had stopped making heroin and even lost some of their trademark rights to both heroin and aspirin at the Treaty of Versailles following the German defeat, heroin was still pouring into US society. A court ruling in 1919 made it illegal for doctors to prescribe heroin to addicts. So, organized crime syndicates, first Jewish and later Italian, popped up all over the country to meet the demand. By 1924, 98% of New York's drug addicts were believed to be heroin addicts. By making a living off of digging up scraps of metal and selling them, they even gave rise to the term junkies. In that same year, the use and manufacture of heroin was banned altogether in the US, even for medical purposes. The 1930s and 40s saw its infiltration into American culture. Jazz musicians like Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, and Joe Pass became addicts. Ray Charles was famously plagued by heroin addiction. Though the government started to clamp down on the heroin trade, its illicit sale increased over the decades, and the drug had infiltrated American society to stay for good. What had been intended as a wonder drug would go on to ruin millions of lives, and to this day still does. Dresser left Baer a wealthy man, but he spent his final years alone, a childless widower with few friends. It's rumored he took heroin daily to treat his health problems, and became an addict. He died of a stroke in 1924. 4 days before Christmas. The great irony is that a daily dose of aspirin, the drug he had first shunned, could have prevented his death, but instead, he opted for his beloved heroin. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.